Hello, Jen.
Hey, good to see you.
Thank you. How are you doing? What's been going on in your life?
I am good. I'm back into like a normal week this week. So last week my
Mm.
husband went snowboarding for the week. So I was
Wow.
like, oh, so they're adult in the house. So it's quite nice. The last time he went was March 2020. So the
Wow.
runs were being closed as as he'd get to the bottom and then they'd close it off
Oh
basically.
my goodness.
I know there was this joke about like just how powerful he is as a snowboarder, and so the amount of places they could go to was getting smaller and smaller because each day would be like, oh, we can't go back to the old place, and then the flights were stopped. His was the last flight out of I can't remember where they were, France, Italy, or something, this kind of thing.
It was the start of the end of the world.
It was the start of the end of the world, and then look where we are, 5 years later, and the world hasn't ended.
Yeah, we recovered.
We did recover, but at that time, it felt like, are we going to?
Apocalyptic. Yeah, it did.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Feels like
it
one of the
did.
first things that no generation before us had experience where we could say, I know this is going to be okay because
Yeah.
our parents or our grandparents can live the tale of living through it and seeing the end of it.
Yeah, there wasn't any, we were like digging around, weren't we, for like narratives of like, has this happened before? And there was some like vague connection with this, like the Spanish flu, wasn't it, where the people were covering their faces. Um, but yeah, no one could really remember anything about it. So even in the history didn't seem to write about it. Like nobody wrote about it. Everybody just, I don't know whether that was just stoicism or, but nobody seemed to write anything about it. Well, people have written about the pandemic in their droves. So
I was working in a secondary school at the time, so kind of when we went into lockdown and then afterwards. And there was this really interesting thing that happened where some people really struggled to like exit out of everything that we had had to believe about ourselves
yeah,
during, especially during the lockdown, but then during that constant, we're in different tiers, we're doing this, we're doing that,
yeah,
lockdowns, all of this sort of thing. I remember it being some people are like, yes, this is it, I'm ready to be around everybody else. And then other people are like, no, I can't change. I don't know if I can let myself relax. I can't let myself be
yeah,
safe. I can't let myself believe that going back to the old normal that's my current new normal
yeah.
is going to be okay.
It's so true. Things that we didn't notice about each other suddenly became like defining, didn't they? Like I think in my head as we started coming out of it, I had this graph where on the one axis you had response to risk, and on the other like attitude to risk, and then attitude to rules. And where the two converged, very much decided how everybody. So if you had a very open to risk, but your sense of rule abiding was high, then you still wouldn't do very much. If you were sort of laissez-faire when it came to the rules and also to risk, then those were the people that would just way would just do whatever we want, and it wasn't. But it was being treated as a very moral,
Yep.
like people were moral or immoral, but it was really something that we just maybe didn't notice about each other before. It's just in terms of those like how we respond to those things. It was a crazy time, and it feels like we're still very like post pandemic. I find myself still talking about that. We're still living with some of the consequences, and we're still recovering, but it doesn't. We're not operating by and large under those like with the same levels of fear, or it's not controlling our lives in the same way, is it?
There's an interesting thing around what our history was before then as well.
Yeah,
Because if we were somebody who had constantly felt, well, if all the chips are down, I know I'm going to be alone. That kind of looking out in life for,
yeah,
am I going to be alone? Is anybody actually going to be there? Because I don't believe they are. And
yeah,
then suddenly, okay, I can't leave my house easily. I can't
yeah,
spend time with people I want. Suddenly I am alone. It
yeah,
then brought up this whole sort of what happens for us then if the things it is that we
yeah,
believed or the fears that we had based on our history suddenly then comes back. What's that like for us?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's right. I think it landed differently for everybody, didn't it? That
Yeah.
experience, depending on the history that they brought into it. So, we were just saying before we started, didn't we? If somebody came into the pandemic with a bit of anxiety around sickness and illness, or anxiety around, oh, I don't really want to catch people's colds or people's like that was already quite a thing, then the pandemic landed into that space and sort of got blown up. Similarly, in terms of like, if you already felt a bit lonely before you went into the pandemic, then that was going to be absolutely a brutal time. Yeah, and I thought as well it was interesting how we desperately looked for connection, like all the way through that. Like, that I might know with my family, it was almost like everybody woke up in the morning and thought, what is realistically postable for me today? Like we just posted the most random things to each other because it was the one way that we could like physically connect with a very physical family. We was making a lot of contact. I think, there was cake and biscuits and just random stuff flying through the post every day. Newspaper articles, cards, pictures. Just like, how do I make a connection? How do I physically make a connection? So
WhatsApp groups where we'd play Guess the Animal. And so somebody, like just a whole group of people that didn't know I was their only connection between them. And we'd all just be like, right, I'm thinking of an animal. It looks like this. And I'm like, I would never do that now. I would never be
imagine.
like, guys, none of you know each other, but I'm going to make you guess the animal in my head.
Yeah, it was it's interesting, isn't it, how we adapt to those moments. Yeah, and I guess that like links nicely into what we were talking about last time. So we talked in the last couple of episodes around how trauma affects people with learning disabilities, how it affects organisations, and about this like regulation, deregulation piece. And I think we finished last episode talking about the key that like although it can feel scary talking about trauma, it can feel overwhelming, it can feel like, oh my goodness, like it feels like so many more people are experiencing or trying to process trauma than we had maybe considered before. But the key, like that hangs this whole piece, is that it's recoverable, and and really difficult experiences are we can recover from them. And I thought it would be like just like useful for us to drill down into that a little bit more today, um, and to think about like why, like what's happening it for a person, and I guess we can broaden it out into like organizations, like what, because we're talking about like a bodily process, aren't we? Like what trauma is a very bodily experience, and things change inside of the body and inside of the wiring and the neurology. So what's happening there, and why can that be recovered from? Because I think that really makes sense of the piece that I went to the US to find out more about, which is trauma informed care. That when we understand that process, we understand why, like the trauma informed care idea is so critical. So like we often say like trauma is adaptive, don't we? So like what's that mean from your perspective? How do you think about that?
I I think of it as a bit like we have a bruise or we have a wound somewhere on us,
Mm,
and we'll notice if we knock it that actually that's incredibly painful.
mm.
And we will then do everything it is that we can to avoid that being knocked. So
Yeah,
we might cover it,
protect
or
it.
we might walk with like that bit of our arm hidden behind us so nobody can get close to it.
Mm,
Or we might kind of go, okay, I'm not going to go and do all these things that are going to make that more painful.
mm.
And so in a way we adapt in that way because we know that that is there. And
Yeah,
over time, even as that wound might start to be less angry and less sort of ragey, we then still also have got into, I'm going to use the word habit, but it's much bigger than that with trauma.
yeah,
We've got
yeah.
into that habit of like hiding that part, keeping it behind us, and not going out and looking at what it is that's going to make a difference. I think
Yeah.
the two things that heal are relationship and safety.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess that's one of the things that's like really critical, isn't it? Because if you don't have to do much to make, as we said about a bruise, you don't really have to do anything for a bruise to heal, as long as you don't keep bumping it. Like it is you, like your body organically, it heals itself over time. So, what they say, like time heals all wounds. Certainly time heals most bruises, but time does not heal trauma. Um, if you do nothing and you stay in that sort of protected state, it doesn't heal. Um, but I always find it like fascinating that trauma comes by and large through relational damage, doesn't it? It becomes through either one um, very dramatic experience of um, lost safety relationally, or more typically through repeat experiences of lost safety relationally. Um, and what's so like what where the challenge is in terms of finding those healing spaces is that makes us very protected and defended against people, but it is people and relationships that create the restoration and allow somebody to recover. Yeah, I think I oh, go on.
I was going to say, how would you say that this is different with somebody with learning disabilities?
I don't think the process is different. Um, I think the risks and the complexity around what can create a loss of safety for someone um, uh, is greater. So there's maybe more at stake. Um, yeah. So maybe it's worth drilling back down into that sort of. I think for me, I often think of it as like I think one of the really important things to remember, because if you've had a trauma, if you've experienced trauma, it can, particularly over time, or if you've got an experience of complex trauma and your body has adapted to that loss of safety. So we talked last time, didn't we, about um, that fear response, that you feel frightened and your brain switches into fight, flight, freeze mode, and that's the adaptation. You adapt to the fear in order that you've got the functioning that you need to protect yourself from the threat. And when somebody is traumatized, what happens is that fight, flight, freeze mechanism in the brain becomes dominant. So, and that is still an adaptive response. If you think about somebody who's maybe maybe living in a space or in a war zone, or even in a home that is like consistently unsafe, they need to be on high alert. They need to have their fight, flight, freeze mechanisms ready to go. But the cost of that, as you described last time with that sort of upstairs, downstairs part of your brain, the cost of that is that you uh, you don't feel regulated, so really high levels of anxiety, but also you're really struggling with lots of other sort of higher level functionings of the brain. So you're struggling with sort of executive functioning, you're struggling with problem solving, you're struggling with like that learning and reasoning part of your brain that allows you to think clearly. So everything begins to feel very, very chaotic. And not that many people can always articulate what I'm feeling is a loss of safety. Instead, what they tend to experience is what I'm feeling is chaos, anxiety. I just don't feel like I can pull myself together. Maybe it would be that kind of a sense, but it's an adaptive thing. It's not because nothing's broken, nothing's gone wrong. Actually, everything's gone right because your brain has and your body has set you in a state to adapt to the loss of safety in your relationships and in the world around you. And so I think that's really, really important. Like you almost like as we start to unravel that, or as we see that somebody's in a traumatized state, it's really important to find a way to express to that person, like, well done, that's brilliant. Like it's brilliant that you knew to shut down. It's brilliant that you knew to be like in a fight, flight, freeze space. Like you did everything right. Your body was really looking after you. Your body's been protecting you. Everything about you has defended you, and that's absolutely like that's great. Like almost, I think it's good sometimes for people as they're processing that, almost to say to themselves, like, "Thank you, well done, thank you for helping me to adapt to an unsafe space and to unsafe people. Like I did a good job there." Nothing went wrong, nothing broke. But it's hard, and you talked about it, and you like that sort of, once you've started protecting something, we get into that habitual state where we're always protecting it. And I guess where it starts to not serve the person any longer is that even when they move into a space that is safe. So, if you think about a family that's goes into a refuge, they are given a safe space. They do have a place that isn't perpetually where they're not perpetually at risk. But the body can't just settle itself. You can't just say to your body, "It's okay now." You can switch off the high alert. We're good. Like you can relax. Like the body has adapted itself into a particular way of working, and it needs time, and most particularly, it needs repeat experiences of safety in order to trust that it can begin to lower the levels of protection against threats. But I think one of the things I always try and keep in mind is this is it's a software issue. It's not a hardware issue. Somebody has not been hardwired um, for for a fear response. They have been softwired for a fear response. So you can't change the hardware on your computer. You won't have anything left, but you can change the software on your computer. Now, if that software was put in from day one, so if you've got someone who's been existing from predominantly a threat response since they were an infant, that is a lot of undoing. It's not a small job, and it's going to take really, really long time. And there'll probably be elements that are just really, really hard to unpick and to recover from. But it is still fundamentally a software issue. It's not a hardware issue. Yeah, so we adapted. If we think about someone who's trauma, they adapted into a trauma response. Their body did a good job, protected them and defended. They adapted into it, and they can adapt to a safety response as well. But what that's going to take, if you think about a young person who's had repeat experiences of lost safety, they're going to need not just the same amount of experiences of safe relationships. They're going to need multiples of those in order for the body to begin to learn to identify safety, to identify that there is a way for it to let go of some of those defense mechanisms and begin to learn to adapt to safety, if you like.
So when my son was born, he didn't feed very well. And so for his first few months, he was just like constantly hungry. And we didn't
Mm.
realize he was a very young baby. And as he got older, into sort of older babyhood and early toddlerhood, he would carry food around with him. And we
Mm.
were kind of like, oh, this is so interesting. And
Yeah.
I never met friends who had children the same age that would do this. And we treated it as if a part of him is recalling the lack of food he had when he was really little and how
Mm.
frightening. And he obviously, as a very young baby, wouldn't have put the word frightening on it, but his body would have still been responding of, I'm
Yeah.
scared that the food isn't going to be there. And so we talked about it a lot with him and let him carry food around with him and let him do all of these kind of things. And the number of people that were like, no, it's fine now. Like, obviously it's fine. He can look in the cupboards, he can see it, all of these kind of things. And it reminded me a lot when I've heard and I've worked with adults where there has been a loss or a lack throughout life. And a logical reasoning part of a brain, the people around may well say, well, of course that's not the same now. Like, look around you, can see all these people. Your job is secure, your family is secure, all of this, you've got enough.
Yeah.
But that real deep hole, that longing, is still there because there hasn't been enough of the other experiences. And there also hasn't been the work done to explore what those feelings were at that time, what it was like not having those kind of things and not having those experiences being met.
That's such a helpful story, I think. And I really love that that's from your son, who wouldn't have any narrative around, like, he can't tell the story that there was a time when I was worried that I wasn't going to get enough food, but his body remembers. So somewhere in his body that has got lodged. And so he is like adaptively like squirreling away food because there's part of him that feels like, oh, it's part of me that just needs to know that I've got food on me. And like the way that you've processed that with him, that reminds me so much of, I think, of two different young people that I've worked with learning disabilities and severe and autism, both of them without any verbal communication, and both of them with experiences of so not the same as your boy, but like who had actually had neglect in their family home. So we knew that they had had experiences where they just didn't have enough access to food. And with the young lady, I remember that she did some similar things. So she would like she just used to grab little, if she saw some food, even food on the floor, she just used to grab it and tuck it away somewhere. And she also used to tuck food into the sides of her mouth, like how hamsters hold food in their mouth. I think it was probably unusual for her to not have something in her little jowls here. In fact, one time I remember, and sometimes she would hold water in her mouth as well. And I remember one time saying, "What have you got in your mouth?" And because we developed this good relationship, she trusted me not to tell her to take it out of her mouth. Um, she opened her mouth, she showed me, she pointed, and she had peas all down the side of her mouth. Yeah. I said, "Oh, you're holding peas in your mouth," and they weren't even crushed. She'd learnt to hold this food and protect it. Um, and the other thing she used to do was ram her mouth. So she would try and get as much food into her mouth as possible. And the thing I found really interesting, and this is again where I think, when you asked me, I think your first question ages ago was how do people with learning disabilities respond to this? Is I think that oftentimes when someone with a learning disability is trying to process a lost safety experience, what happens is it gets diagnosed or it gets called a behaviour. So this was called a behaviour, and it was ascribed to sensory needs. So she has sensory needs, she needs to overstimulate her mouth, and therefore she rams it with food and she stores stuff in her mouth, and we have to tell her to take it out. And so she was continually told to take food out of her mouth, continually told off if she shoved food in her mouth. And I really felt for her, because once you put these responses against the history of neglect, it made complete sense. It was a completely obvious thing to do. It was just like she was highly unlikely to be allowed to walk around with a biscuit like your boy could. And so she found this way of storing food. I remember another young man that I worked with who he would be really happy and then he would just lose it, like shouting, screaming, crying, just like that. It could happen so fast. And we began to realise that this was hunger, and he again had had an experience of neglect and not having access to food. And what had happened was that the hunger was terrifying to him, very similar to how a baby responds to hunger, that because they don't have a story about I'm hungry and that's why my tummy hurts. Instead, they're often, where the psychotherapy theory is like they experience it as being attacked, like something is attacking me, something wants me to die. So they scream blue murder, like that. That's what's going on for them, and it becomes like almost like a life or death thing. And that's how he screamed like he was dying. It was so dramatic. And I was really conscious that like an ordinary response to him would be like some kind of behavioural management tool where we managed his tantrums, or we try and he learns that screaming doesn't get him what he wants, like screaming isn't going to be effective, all that kind of stuff. And I was really worried about that. And with this young man, I had a little bit more influence about what happened. So we talked with the team, and we went back through his history of neglect. And what the team did is like really similar. Like they just had like a bag on them, and they always had food and drink. And even if it was like just some crackers or some biscuits, they always had something. So the second he started getting upset, they could just pass him a biscuit. And I think it took a bit of getting over for some of the team, because this didn't feel like good behavioural management. This felt like, and if you look at it from a behaviour lens, it's not good behaviour management. You're literally rewarding the screaming. But if he is responding to the fear of being hungry, which put him, previously in real, genuine risk, then we have to give him the opportunity to learn. I said, like, he needs repeat experiences of there being food available and of fast. And if his body can learn that food is always there, then he will not need to freak out anymore. So that's when we've got that, like, if you think like long experience of lost safety, the terror of not having food, and then many, 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 many repeat experiences of safety around food, that slowly over time lift the trauma off of that, lift the terror off of that, so that he can learn, okay, in terms of food, I'm safe. Yeah. And I guess that, like, it's nice to talk about it, isn't it, in terms of those quite concrete examples of like, we know there was a fear of lost food, and we can slowly begin to change somebody's experience and relationship with food and people, and understand I'm in a space where I don't need to feel terrorized about food. But when we have somebody who has experienced a lot of trauma in their life, that's happening for them on multiple. It's not just about food, is it? It's about all sorts of different things. It's about what people mean. Are people safe? Do I have anything that I need? Is my body safe? Am I safe inside myself? It's happening on multiple, multiple, multiple layers. Yeah. So I guess and this hopefully sets us up for thinking about what trauma-informed care is all about. But if somebody hasn't felt safe for a prolonged period of their life, or their body has adapted into a fear response, rightly, because they were not in a safe space, they were not, they were under threat, and that is predominantly going to have come through relationships, then it's not going to be enough for them to find one person who is safe to them. They are going to need some people that are safe to them, but more important than that, they're going to need a whole environment that promotes and creates safety for them. Not just the physical safety, that there's no hazards in the corridor, but it's about not just being safe, but feeling safe. And so, like, a lot of our work, isn't it, about trying to create this dual intervention level where we'll put something around the child that helps to promote and to grow that sense of safety on the relational level, on the dyad level, one between them and a staff member, or them and a family member. But then also we're trying to create this whole space that feels safe to them, that doesn't feel like it re-traumatizes them, or reminds them of that, like, so that their body can begin to settle, and trust that there is enough safety for them to slowly adapt out of that fear response.
It takes a big onboarding from a lot of people.
Yeah, yeah,
You
yeah,
talk about
absolutely.
how it's named as a behavior so often, and we treat the behavior.
Yeah,
And what it is that we are offering and what it is that we're suggesting, we're aware is a big thing.
yeah, that's
Really
it.
looking forward to when we talk next time, because we're going to look at some of what this looked like in practice in some of the places
Yeah,
it is that you visited,
yeah,
and how how on board people were. because
Mm.
there will always be people that say, well, let's treat the behaviour.
Yeah,
Because in a way that's easier and we can write that up, but it's also less costly for us.
yeah. It is less costly, but I also think there's less wins, and that's maybe
Mm,
something we'll talk about. That one of the one of the things about like this trauma-informed care approach is that yeah, it is a lot. There's no getting away from it, but the benefits are across the board.
absolutely.
Great.
Thank
All
you.
right. See you next time, Jen.
See you next time. Bye.